What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. The metagame this week feels a little bit more open, although, in my opinion, the same archetypes are still at the very top of it. However, it is my humble opinion that this deck is by far, the best deck in the game to climb with. Anyone who is playing other stuff is either specialized as a master of it, or is looking to gain an edge on this deck. This deck is the clearest outlier I've seen in a while for absolutely the best deck in the game. I do not think there is a huge conversation about it. I think other people can like more decks in a different way, but I think this deck is the clear actual number one in the format. And that's actually kind of rare. Normally there's a lot of debate about it, but the interesting thing about this deck is it is far from unbeatable. It's just very good. This is not a deck that feels unfair to play against or as, frankly, but it is a deck that I think consistently has better numbers than just about everything else in the game. Now that means in terms of the points it puts on the board, it is top class. In terms of flexibility, it is top class. In terms of ability to maneuver and change and deal with locations, it is top class. It passes every single test with flying colors. Is it perfect? No, but it is as close to a 100% just absolutely excellent deck list that we have had in a very long time. This deck has not had to change, and frankly, that's because there's not a lot of room for it to change. It is just perfectly constructed already. There is nothing I would ever change about it. This deck has a ton of points, it has incredibly relevant interaction in the form of Cosmo, and it has a massive amount of ability to adapt to various locations as they pop up. There are so many good locations for this deck. Anything that lets Claw win is an amazing location. Ongoing locations are very good for you. Tons of great locations, very few bad ones. And that means that this deck just has a lot of good matchups. A lot of the other decks that are in Tier 1 alongside this deck are in there because they do not get run over by this deck. But most of Tier 2 gets really hammered by this deck. It is the infinitely strongest deck in the game right now, in my opinion. Many people will be familiar with the most direct competition to that deck in terms of decks threatening it, in terms of meta share, in terms of power, in terms of actually being able to beat it heads up, and they are Storm, War Machine, Legion decks, and this is perhaps the best of them, although I do think that there is room to explore in this archetype. Right now, it is my opinion that the Alioth Cosmo aspect of this deck is so frighteningly powerful that I wouldn't want to give it up. There are various changes you could make in this general shell. You could even go further towards a Heimdall-style old-school move deck, but the essence of it is the same. The points in this deck come from the move package. The control in this deck comes from Storm, War Machine, and Legion. The Storm works with both your move package and your combo, which means that you are able to set up situations where you have so many paths to victory. You can have a Storm lane that you win by moving stuff into it. You can have a Storm lane that you combo out of with War Machine and Legion. And you can have just simply winning a Storm lane and playing the Infinite, or locking your opponent out of a Storm lane and then Aliothing their big cards that they're really expecting to get the on reveals of, like Hitmonkey and Sage. This is a deck that has an incredible amount of threat to it. It is a scary deck to play against, one of the scariest. The only thing you really need to be concerned with is one specific play pattern that is becoming more and more common. When people get stormed, they are willing to and should be playing Cosmo into that Storm lane so you cannot Legion it. That is one of the issues that this deck has, because when you have the combo, you very often want to snap it. People are getting smarter about that too, but being able to flip that back on you is actually a meaningfully worrying thing a decent amount of the time. It's not amazing, but it is something you are going to want to think about when you're playing this deck. Now, we've talked about Agent Venom, we've talked about Storm, War Machine. What is the third sector of this metagame? In my opinion, it's US agent decks. And there is a lot of overlap between these things. Like, you can play a US Agent deck with Agent Venom in it. There are going to be a couple of those on the tier list too. The reason US Agent is so powerful right now is because of how good it is into that deck, which I would consider the best deck in the game. It is a very powerful card that has a ton of utility against the kind of strategy that is trying to play Iron Man. Being able to make Iron Man go -4 power is completely berserk. And so the general shape of a lot of decks that I like to think of as US Agent decks are decks that are constructed to have a good matchup into the Iron Man mid-range deck. Almost every US Agent deck will end up being favored because they are almost exclusively being played for that matchup. Now, that's not to say it's the only thing they do, but it is mostly the reason they exist. This one is called Stinky Smoove. Yo Woody's been playing it for a while, Big Baby's been playing it for a while, and I think right about now is the right time for a deck like this. This is a powerful strategy, and it is a strategy that has a lot of upside against the best deck in the game, while also not sacrificing anything to get it. It's not like you're going out of your way to play US Agent. You want to be playing US Agent anyway. This is a powerful affliction strategy that leverages Luke Cage Hazmat, Ajax, Man-Thing, and US Agent to have as good of a matchup as possible against the best deck in the game, while not giving up anything in other matchups because those cards are just straight up respectable across the board. I'm not sure how far down the ladder this deck has percolated, but I consider it a very relevant part of the metagame, personally, to me. This is a deck that I see, honestly, probably like 10% of my games are this deck. It is built on restricting options. I consider it the new Goon Knight, and as many people may remember, Goon Knight was my name for the Moon Knight deck with Moon Knight and Black Bolt, and, you know, a lot of the same cards that you see here with a Darkhawk finishing package, and the hood is what you're trying to do on the final turn of the game. That is sort of out, and this is in, because it is better at doing that thing. You have multiple ways of saying up to 3 draws per game can get restricted. You get multiple repeats on Black Widow. You have the ability to do things like play Black Widow, misery it, and then bring it back with a Phoenix Force, blocking draws on turn 4, 5, and 6. Just an absolutely monstrous strategy that is very powerful when it comes together. When it doesn't come together, you're a little bit less than what other mid-range decks are. Like, you are kind of muddling along when you're not doing this. You don't have the power of an Agent Venom deck. You're mostly just trying to get there and hope that, like, you know, maybe they drew enough rocks and you're able to actually, like, maneuver into a situation where you win. But this deck is the sort of, I won't call it a clog deck. It's not a clog deck, but the people that were playing a lot of clog decks, I think, are really attracted to this deck as a play style. It is the same sort of ethos of saying, I'm gonna make, like, you know the saying about, you know, don't wrestle with a pig. It knows how to fight in the mud. I really butchered that, but, like, it'll drag you down to its level, and it's more experienced at winning those games at its level, is really what I'm trying to get at here. This is the deck that appeals to people who want to see, like, single-digit numbers in every lane across the game when it's turn 6. That's what this deck does. It is quite strong. If you want a further breakdown, I did a video on it only a couple days ago. I don't know exactly how many people pay super close attention to the way I construct these videos, but a lot of the time there's like a group of decks sort of near the end that encompasses like Destroy and Discard and Surfer and Zoo that are all like playable, but none of them I really absolutely love. And I think there's not like a hard order in these deck lists. Sometimes it gets a little muddled in the middle, but generally the closer to the beginning of the list you are, the more I like you. Not a hard rule, not a fast rule, none of that, but it is a general rule. And I think that it bears pointing out that this is about as high as I've had any of those, whatever you want to call that group of decks, the like, just the decks that sort of build themselves in the game, where there's like really not a lot for you to do thinking wise. It's just like, oh, it's Zoo, I play the 1-drops. Oh, it's Surfer, I play the 3-drops. Oh, it's Discard, I play the discard cards. Oh, it's Destroy, I play the Destroy cards. It's been a long time since one of them was this good. And I genuinely do believe that. Like, I'm not saying this is an amazing, goated, god tier deck. I think there are a couple Agent Venom decks that we're going to circle back to that are probably better than it, right? But if you're looking at like sectors of the metagame, you have the Agent Venom sector, the Storm War Machine sector, the Move sector, the Darkhawk PF sector, all the stuff we've talked about, right? And if you're looking at it like that, I think most good decks fit into those sectors. They're doing something of those. And this is a really legitimately good deck that isn't doing those things. It's not a US Agent Afflict deck. It's not a Storm War Machine deck. It's not a Move deck. It's not a Agent Venom deck. It is something completely different and genuinely functional. And I think that there should be some heed paid to that. This is as good as I think any of those like build it on its own decks have been since Zoo was Elite, and I think that matters. So let's swing back to the Agent Venom sector just for a little bit. This is a deck that is one of the stronger decks in the game, in my opinion. The issue is it the best Agent Venom deck? That's a little bit more up for grabs. This list I have found can compete with the best Agent Venom decks and is so confusing on the final turn in terms of output that I do think it's roughly in that range, but I think it's a little bit less consistent in terms of what it actually does. It's also much more vulnerable to like random locations screwing you. Because of the way the Grandmaster works, you actually need to be able to play stuff in the middle a lot of the time because your best draws with this deck are things like Beast on 4, Grandmaster the Beast to the middle, so you get 2 Beasts on 5, right? Or something like Gwenpool, and then Grandmaster the Gwenpool to the middle. That's also really good. But what you need for that to happen is to be able to move cards to the middle, and there are sometimes locations that prevent that from happening. You need to be able to have your on reveals go off in the side lanes, and there are sometimes locations that prevent that from happening. One of the other things that you're really going to want to pay attention to with this deck is planning ahead, because you need to make sure that you hit your high value on reveals with the Grandmaster. It's gotta be something really good. I really do focus on Beast, I focus on Gwenpool, and so setting up lanes such that you can do that is actually quite important when you play this list. Other than that, it's really just a straightforward points deck. If you Agent Venom a Mysterio, it's 4/4/4. If you hit it with Gwenpool buffs, it gets even bigger, and those buffs, of course, also go on to the Mysterio clones. So you're very often playing, you know, an 18 power 2-drop, and that's really where the strength of this deck comes from. Obviously, it is also a US Agent deck. US Agent, we've talked about why that's a good card right now. It remains a good card. It plays for basically 2/7 in every matchup, and then against certain decks, it plays for like 2/11, 2/15. And that's really all you can ask from this deck because it really is a straightforward points deck. The previous deck and this deck have actually been my most successful Agent Venom decks recently, and I think that's part of just like my personal preference as a player to be a deck that has something close to the best deck in terms of output, but feels favored into it. And that's what I feel like both of these decks are really trying to accomplish. They are both Agent Venom US Agent decks, which means they are trying to be the US Agent deck that beats the other US Agent decks. Sorry, the Agent Venom deck that beats the other Agent Venom decks. I don't know why they keep making names like this. Not only am I mixing up Agent Venom and US Agent, there's a card coming out soon called Anti-Venom. I can't wait for AV to no longer actually refer to the card I've been calling AV for 3 weeks. Just unreal for the record. And anyway, this deck is attempting to be a deck that is trying to hard counter, or as much as you can hard counter. I think it's actually quite difficult to hard counter the AV Iron Man deck. You can have a good matchup, but you can't like have a free one. And this is a deck that has a really good matchup. And I think part of what makes the AV Iron Man deck so strong is that it is so hard to counter. It's just like you think it's easy, but anything that's actually good against it that isn't US Agent is going to get Cosmoed, and so it's able to cover its own ass very well. It's hard to like hard tech against it. Like you see a deck like this that's playing US Agent, it's playing Rogue, it's got all the tech in the world, but only US Agent's actually going to work through a Cosmo, and that might not even win that lane, depending on how much buffer the cards in that lane are than they would normally be thanks to their Agent Venom. Now, this is a strong deck. I've had a lot of success with it. I've really enjoyed it, and I think that this deck and the previous deck are actually high-level recommendations. I've enjoyed them a lot. I've been very successful with them, and I think people, It is clear to me that the AV Iron Man deck is the best deck in the game, but if you want to be playing something a little bit off the beaten path, both of these, I think, are great options. Next, let's devote a little bit of time to Agent Venom Bounce, the original Agent Venom deck that has since been passed, in my estimation, by literally every other Agent Venom deck we talked about. I would rather play every single one of them than play AV Bounce. All of them without question. That's where I'm at on AV Bounce right now. It ends up being just a little bit too easy to target. If you run into that Sera deck and get Killmongered, you are devastated. If you run into decks playing Shadow King, you are devastated. You don't play Cosmo, you can't play Cosmo, and so you just end up being a deck that has similar point outputs to the other AV decks, but is just worse at interacting, and that is a really bad spot to be. It's not the worst AV deck in the game. There is one that is worse, but I do think that this is a deck that has hit the point of, like, this is now in the tier with, like, Zoo and Destroy, and it's like, all right, pump the brakes. If you have AV, I'm sure you can do something better than this at this point. This list was cooked up by Derek and Barzy. It is an anti-meta chef deck. I believe Browday played it on his way to the top 8 of the Snap Creator Tournament, and it is just a solid, good deck that has reasonable tech and a lot of points. And I think one of the things that gets lost in metagames like this is the idea that because your opponent is playing like an Agent Venom deck, it's just very, very hard for you to actually win. And that is not necessarily true. Now, you see this deck leveraging Super Scroll. I think that's a hard ask for any deck to actually get in there. This is a card that is a dead card a decent amount of the time. But when it is not a dead card, it will absolutely win that matchup. But this, I think, demonstrates the degree to which you have to actually tech if you want to have a good matchup into that AV Iron Man deck. Because basically every other tech card that isn't Super Scroll or US Agent is going to beat or lose to Cosmo. And that's a real issue. If I had to pinpoint the one issue with that deck from a balance perspective, it is similar to the issue that Shuri had, where it's, you want to try to interact with this, but they just get to run Cosmo for free because they have so many points. They have so many points that they can just afford to run Cosmo, and that's a rare thing. A lot of the time, the best decks in the game aren't so point heavy that they can be Cosmo gamers. I think a lot of the time they have to actually use that slot on something real, but this deck doesn't. And that means that when you're really building to beat it, like this deck is, you gotta run something that doesn't get Cosmoed. Same but different here with Batman Big Boys. This is yet another attempt at US Agent Ajax. There are, I believe this is the second of 3 that we'll talk about here. This is sort of overlapping a little bit with The Cook that we just discussed, but it is a, again, like it's, okay, how do we beat Iron Man stuff? Easy answer, Hazmat, Ajax, Man-Thing, that kind of stuff. That's how we do it, US Agent, right? This is another attempt at making that shell make sense. It's a very solid one, but there is honestly not a ton to talk about here because if you've watched all of this video, you understand what this deck is trying to do, you understand the role it has in the metagame, and it's really just putting a different twist on something that is already fundamentally a solid option. Speaking of different twists on solid options, this is my build of the Quicksilver Wiccan Ajax deck. It's doing the exact same thing. Like, it's literally, again, this is the exact same thing. This is just a different method of attempting to do it. I do feel like people have been giving credit to people that aren't me for this, and I feel like I know people like Andre Var and Ica have been working on this, but I've been working on this too. And as far as I'm aware, the build of it that has been performing the best, the one with the Scorpion and the Copycat in it, this build was the one I just put together on stream a bit ago, right? Like, I don't know if it was like 8 days ago or 9 days ago or whatever. I don't know when it was, but not only did I like first sort of get this archetype off the ground, I think a little bit, I also feel like I got to the best deck and no one's giving me credit for it, damn it. So I'm going to give me credit for it. I like this deck, but full disclosure, I do think it's entirely possible that either Stinky Smoove or the Batman Big Boys deck is executing the strategy or the method of attacking the metagame that this deck is trying to do just a little bit better right now. The loss of White Widow was pretty tough for this deck. Having just a great 2-drop that really helped your strategy was really good, and we don't have that anymore. And I think that generally speaking, I'd probably be rather playing the other two, but this is still, again, if you are trying to attack this metagame, decks like this are a great way to start. There is a US Agent deck that is good. Of that, I am sure. It deserves to be a sector of the metagame, and it is one. Scream is a weird card because I actually think she's a little bit underrated, personally. I think that the Scream decks are legitimately kind of good. The issues they have are all related to point output. And for that reason, I do think that if you're going to play a Scream deck, it has to be a War Machine Storm deck, because otherwise you are going to get outpointed by these AV decks. And I think we live in a world where the AV decks are what they are. And Scream is solid. It's a good little mid-range card. It really is kind of like the mid-range card that could. But you don't really have a lot of options when your opponent starts dropping Iron Men that have 4 power. You kind of just eat it. And that means you need to be able to make them eat it right back with Storm, War Machine, and Legion. With other decks, it's more about the synergy between Storm, War Machine, Legion, and your basic plan. Things like the Move deck have that synergy. This deck, it's really Storm, War Machine, and Legion is covering the ass of your basic plan, and then against things that are actually, similarly mid-rangey to you, your basic plan is actually quite good. This is a good deck in mid-range mirrors. It really is. But it runs into issues when the numbers get really, 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 really big. I think Arishem kind of sucks right now. And I'll be sort of frank about why that is. It's because the best deck in the game runs Cassandra Nova. You don't like that. You hate that. Not only does the best deck in the game run Cassandra Nova, there's a significant population of Darkhawk Cassandra Nova gamers now. You hate that even more. Arishem was kind of struggling already, but this is as hostile as the meta has been to him since he was actually the best deck. I wouldn't be shocked if there's more. It's probably not more Cassandra right now, but it's like probably genuinely kind of close to those times. I think, it's probably not like 35%, but I wouldn't be surprised if like Cassandra was pushing like, high teens play rate here. And that's just abysmal. You hate that. You are very sad when that happens. You do not like that at all. This deck is as fun and as cool and as unique as you remember it being, but like, it cannot handle that kind of stuff. It cannot handle a deck that has the point output that a lot of these decks do. And I think that's the other thing. When I play against Arishem, I'm like a pretty conservative snapper. I bully snap this deck. Its output range is not that large. You just beat them. Like, you just beat them by going wide. This deck cannot handle any kind of reasonable turn from like the Sera deck. Let's say there's an 8-power Mysterio in hand. It can't do that. It can't handle the point output across all the lanes that all of these Agent Venom decks are capable of doing. Alioth is cool, but it's not gonna do everything for you. And this is a metagame that's like heavy Shadow King, heavy Cosmo, heavy combo decks locking you out, heavy Cassandra Nova, heavy Darkhawk. There's just so much that this deck hates to see. Couple of classic no Alioth move decks for you, or I should say, maybe not no Alioth. One of them has Alioth in it. Sorry, I lied. But this is the classic aggro move list, and it is a difficult deck to play, but a rewarding one to learn, with a very powerful ability to output a lot of points, Madam Web Cosmo, and have a strong commitment to the board. If you liked playing aggro decks in other card games, this is as close as Marvel Snap gets. You ask questions. Your job is to ask them the question, can you beat my numbers? And they better be able to answer yes, because your numbers are quite large. Havoc might look surprising, but if you hit this dude with an Agent Venom, he is going to be like 12 power. He is just big. This is a deck that is built to do stats at an incredibly high level, has interaction and power thanks to Madam Web, Cosmo, and all of the move cards, and is just well equipped to play a sort of small ball aggro role in this metagame. I was struck by this, and I think, you can look at this and say, this is not all that different from the Storm, War Machine, Legion decks, but I believe this is the deck that Johnson was playing also to the top 8 of the Creator Tournament, and I found it fairly impressive. What I liked about this is it took the move shell, moved away from Storm, War Machine, Legion, and moved towards more proactive tech like Rogue. This gives it a bit of a better matchup into decks like the Iron Man deck because they just simply are not expecting things like Final Turn, Rogue, and Copycat. Rogue, of course, can steal an Iron Man. Copycat has a lot of great hits in that deck that can really make this a dangerous, dangerous situation for them to deal with. This is also a deck that is just very hard to read. Between Madam Web and Heimdall, it's just very difficult to ever get a sense of what's actually going to be the output here. It's a powerful deck that is hard to play against, and probably even harder to play. Let's talk about Destroy. I'm not sure yet if Scorn is a meaningful upgrade here. Sorry, I mean Agony. The symbiotes are really screwing with me here. I've seen people doing it, and it's looked pretty solid, honestly. It's basically like old Forge in this deck. But that's not necessarily to say that you can't play it without Agony. I think it's like a pretty reasonable inclusion, but I've thought that about cards before, and they've ended up just being like flex slots in this deck. Like, I thought that about Aranya, who has like a similar role to Agony, actually, and she just ended up being a flex slot. The thing that Agony runs into is that, like, yeah, it's good, but Deadpool scales multiplicatively, meaning that something like a Hulkbuster, getting that onto Deadpool, putting him at 4 and starting multiplying up from 4 to 8 rather than 3 to 6 can actually result in the difference between winning and losing. Now, the difference is when you have your good draws of like everything you need, it actually is usually better to have Agony. And that is notable to me. Agony also is a little bit easier to actually target if you have like lanes that are already sort of full. So if you want to make a little bit of a half sort of Deadpool kind of game plan, where it's like, all right, maybe I can get this guy. Like if I play Agony, Deadpool, Carnage on 4 or whatever, I might be able to do like Deadpool, Venom the next turn, and then he's at 12, and 12 is like a pretty relevant number. That's the real upside of Agony if you want to get her into this deck, is that she's able to sort of backdoor your Deadpools into being relevant threats in a way that Hulkbuster is often not, both due to the way the lanes clog up and because of his cost. I think Zoo's pretty solid, honestly, but it does sort of run into a couple issues. But one real selling point to this deck is it is genuinely able to compete a lot of the time with the Agent Venom decks. It's not going to necessarily compete with the nut draw Agent Venom decks where they're like, get everything with 4 power, and then they're like, okay, I have a 4 power Iron Man, I've got a bunch of other stuff, but like, it can beat that kind of output. This is a deck that really goes high when it needs to. It spreads well wide across multiple locations. It's not the easiest matchup in the world. They're usually going to have a read they can make to beat you, but that means, by the same token, you will usually have a read you can make to beat them. There are not a lot of decks that can play on even footing with that Iron Man deck, and it is worth pointing out that Zoo is one of those decks. However, and this is important, there are other decks that are probably better at doing everything else. Zoo can play on even footing with that deck, but it runs into issues with everything basically that isn't that deck. There are Agent Venom decks that have Killmonger in them, for example. We talked about those earlier. There are decks that can really outpoint you by focusing on 2 lanes. There are decks that can do a lot of work across 3 lanes. It's a little bit tougher for this deck to exist, despite the fact that, honestly, the matchup into the Iron Man deck isn't as bad as you would think it would be. That's not really a selling point. A selling point is not, it's not as bad as you think. A selling point is it's actively good. And I don't think it's actively good. I think it's like near 50%. Silver Surfer is just solid, although I can't tell how much of that is just people who are experimenting and looking for decks to try to beat the Agent Venom Iron Man deck, playing cards, you know, cards like Hazmat and US Agent, right? This deck ends up being really good into that because you don't have a lot of hits for it, you have your own Luke Cage, like, it's almost like a counter to the counter, but the counter that you're actually beating here isn't really prominent enough for it to make a ton of sense for you to play this deck. Surfer's good. Like, it's a functional, solid deck. I don't think there's anything wrong with playing Surfer. There's a lot of relevant cards in the archetype right now that can do a lot of damage. Even if you don't like these ones, I'm sure you can fit in a card like Red Guardian if you're trying to blow up some Draculas, things like that. I think Rogue is a pretty solid card right now. It's the kind of thing you need to actually have access to in order to be able to beat those Iron Man decks. Yes, they run Cosmo, but if you're able to Rogue it, you're going to be in a pretty okay spot. And the way they sort of set up is that you can set up so like, okay, if they Cosmo here, I have this. If they Cosmo here, I have this other thing, usually a Silver Surfer. It's usually the kind of thing you can try to play around, but you do have to actively think about it all the time. You know how I mentioned there's a worse deck that plays Agent Venom? Yeah, it's Darkhawk. Darkhawk Agent Venom. To me, I won't call this unplayable. It's an Agent Venom deck. There's like a real limit on how unplayable it can get. But it is so much worse than the other Agent Venom deck. Like, by a massive margin, it is just much, much worse. It does not scale as high. It does not have the ability that Claw does to win lanes on the offsides. It plays a worse 1-drop in Korg. It plays a worse 3-drop in Rock Slide. It is just not a great option. But I do want to talk about specifically the card Juggernaut and, to the lesser extent, the card Rogue, which was in the previous deck. Juggernaut and Rogue are the kind of cards that are just sort of randomly everywhere in this meta. Almost all of these decks that we've talked about, with some obvious exceptions, could just like play either of them. And I think that that is the kind of thing that you're going to have to be thinking about a lot. I know I found myself caught off guard by random Juggernauts, random Rogues, out of just decks of stuff. And I don't particularly think Juggernaut especially is not an optimal card right now, but that doesn't mean that people aren't going to play it. And I think that you should be willing to respect Juggernauts and Rogues. Those are cards you're going to see a lot of. You're going to see a lot of Shadow Kings, a lot of US agents. That's just sort of what this metagame is right now. And so there's this weird interplay, right, between these powerful on-reveal cards, Cosmo and Eliath that stop them, and then the ongoing cards like US Agent and Super Skrull that are there to beat the Cosmo stuff. It's a very fascinating metagame, but ultimately, to me, this deck is just a bad version of the first deck we talked about. All right, y'all, thank you so much. As always, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.